Thank you all for your attendance and hopefully your participation in this event this evening. Thank you also to Creative Holywood for making it possible. Eamon Malley was meant to be with us. Unfortunately, something last minute has meant that he can't be here. But it's great to be here with Deric. I've known Deric a very long time. Deric, like Eamon, was about this place in the 1970s in the worst of times. I had no role in the reporting of that period, but as a young teenager, can remember the turmoil and the trauma of that time. I became involved in journalism early 80s and in this kind of conflict and political journalism from about 1985, 1986. The BBC gave me a 3-month contract in 1989, and it took me 17 years beyond that to escape. But it has been both a challenge and a privilege. A privilege, I think, because in our journalist career, we were able to operate, if you like, across the lines in this place. We were able to talk to all sides, communicate with all sides, fall out with all sides along the way, and on most occasions we were able to repair broken relationships. We've come a long distance. You know, the big line that angers me more than any other is when people say to me, sure, nothing's changed. You know, Deric and I know what we had to report throughout the 70s, 80s and 90s. And believe me, everything has changed. And when I say everything, I understand that there is more work still to be done. But we're certainly in a better place. We're going to talk tonight about the book that Deric compiled with Ivan Little of Ulster Television, Reporting the Troubles, where Deric asked almost 70 journalists to write a contribution to that book. My chapter was about my conversations and meetings over the years with 5 P. O'Neills. P. O'Neill, the authorised spokesman of the IRA leadership, of course, not his real name. And I dealt with 5 of those P. O'Neills from the Enniskillen bomb of 1987 through to 2010, including in 2005 when the IRA announced its end to the armed campaign. Why are books like this important? They're important because in our waiting to address the past, we are losing critical living memory. I think just back to the period of 1994, the ceasefire period, and those who were absolutely essential to the making of that at a political level within the IRA, within the loyalist organisations. So many of them no longer with us. And I keep saying to people along the way who've been involved in this process, write it down. Write it down, not for now, but for maybe 20 or 30 years down the road. And Deric persuaded almost 70 of us, free of charge, to write it down for reporting the troubles. And we're going to start this evening, and Deric's going to read a little passage from his book, his many encounters with Margaret Thatcher.
First of all, let me say how delighted I am that I'm in Hollywood. The book basically, I mean, there's been a number of good books about Northern Ireland over the years by journalists. Malley's written a couple. Brian Rowan, as you know, has written a couple of books, including his very acclaimed Unfinished Piece. There's been some really good books. McKittrick's book on Lost Lives, for instance, was probably the most outstanding piece of work. But for me, strangely enough, the book that I really enjoyed was called 10 Men Dead. It was by a guy called David Beresford. He was South African, based in London, and he worked for The Guardian. And he was a bit bohemian in his appearance and looks. And every time Beresford left to go home to London for the weekend, or anytime he left Belfast for a couple of days away, we all knew something was going to happen. And sure enough, we'd hardly touched down in Heathrow when there was some massive atrocity. But he wrote an absolutely superb book. I don't know, it's about the Republican hunger strikes of 1980 and 1981, and for me that was probably the book of the Troubles. This came about basically, was actually my son Deric Jr. had suggested the idea of maybe inviting people in Northern Ireland to write articles looking back on the 50 years that lived here. People, people not necessarily in public life, but people in theatre, people in business, people in sport, people like maybe somebody like Charles Burns, who's big with the GAA and people like that there. But we felt too much like work. Why not just ring Rowan and his mates and get them to contribute? And I have to say, Ivan Little, I've known for over 40 years. Him and I used to work together in the Belfast Telegraph. He's a great friend. He's a fantastic journalist, and he's been really, really good. And everybody we phoned and contacted and asked them if they would contribute to the book, everyone without exception. There were two who said no, for good reasons. They just said, we don't think. These are journalists who had long left the business, had moved on in their lives, and they just didn't want to be bothered, and it was fine. But I remember the first person I called was a guy called Martin Cowley, who worked for the Irish Times and who was in Derry the day of the October Civil Rights March, which basically signalled the outbreak of the Troubles in October 1968. And when he said, "Okay, I'm up for this," everything then quickly fell into place. I even spoke to the broadcasters, because that's the world in which he lived, because he worked for UTV and ITV. Deric, he concentrated on the print journalists and people in Dublin, because it was very important that we got a really good cross-section. People in Dublin, people in London, and obviously people in Belfast, and everybody was very good. Blackstaff were great. They were the publishers. Helen Wright, who was the book editor, was fantastic, because she was dealing with a couple of journalists, and that's not easy.
Bad-tempered ones,
and she was fantastic. So basically, the book came out last September. It's now into its third print, and it's sold exceptionally well. And I know we all asked the contributors to do it for nothing, and everybody agreed, and we were delighted with that. But there's this thing that people have this belief that if you write a really good book, you make an awful lot of money. You don't really. It's just to satisfy
your ego.
The ego, right? and nothing more than that. And the previous book I wrote was the Let This Be Our Secret, about the Colin Howell murders, and it did very well. It sold very well, but it sold very well because there was a TV series made on the back of it. So that's what thing. But in terms of books, and everybody who will tell you that books don't make money. They make money for the publishers, and we don't mind that. But we like to see them on the shelves, so I'm absolutely delighted with the way it's gone, and the way everybody sort of kicked in. Brian there referred to Margaret Thatcher, and I used to work with her quite a lot when she was Prime Minister. The Press Association always had the trouble with Thatcher every time she came to Northern Ireland, and that was maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And she always made a point of coming about the day before Christmas Eve. Christ, and you could just see her far enough. It was always the same. You got the phone call the night before.
Was that not in any eve? Never mind Christmas Eve, you could see her far enough.
You got the phone call the previous night. You know where to be tomorrow. Don't be telling anybody. And if sure enough, you landed up at Aldergrove, and you jumped onto the big Wessex. She was sitting there with her Bernard Ingham, who was her press secretary. You had a couple of girls from the Downing Street office. You had security people. There was always an SAS man at her side, and it was always a hairy ride with Thatcher. And you know, I'm not the best flyer, the best of times, but I mean, I absolutely found it terrifying going with her, because you know, there's a Wessex helicopter. It's a big, noisy, awful way to travel. The doors open. You have a machine gun pointing downwards. You have another helicopter, which turns out it's the decoy. It's to take the hit if the missiles come up, and especially after the Brighton bomb and they tried to kill her. I mean, it was really difficult, and I found it. You know, I mean, there were I had some scary moments in my life, but you know, every time she came to Belfast, it was, you know, I hated every minute of it. And but she was always very civil to me. I got on well with her. I was with her when she, just before she was forced out of office, when she told me when Heseltine mounted the challenge, and she said, you know, I'm confident I'll win this vote and I'll stay in office. And that was the last time we saw her. It was John Major. I remember travelling once with him down to the border just after he took over. I remember he was standing on that big border checkpoint, if you don't remember, on the Dublin Road outside Newry, up on the hill. I'll never forget, you know, following him up the steps, and there's this guy, his first time in Northern Ireland, looking across the South Armagh terrain, this very hostile part of the world, and he did this sort of faraway look on his face, saying, "Jesus, what am I doing here?" But anyway, he was a nice man, and I have to say, despite everything, I always found Thatcher very nice. She was probably one of
You've got your MB already, don't you?
Yeah. No, she was probably one of the three most impressive people that I've ever met, and that mightn't sit too well with some people. But it was Thatcher, there was George Mitchell, and the other guy that I really was impressed with and got to know and like before he died was Martin McGuinness. Now, that doesn't sit well with some people, but he was massively impressive, as she was. But as I say, you know, I travelled with her I don't know how many times, but I remember one particular Christmas she was here, and Jim Pryor was the Secretary of State at the time, and he was trying to launch an initiative to bring all the parties together at Stormont. It was called the Constitutional Convention, and every time Thatcher came here at Christmas, she always made a sort of a State of the Nation speech to the cameras at 6 o'clock to go out on live TV. And I'm there, we've had a long day, and this is basically how it finished. And I referred to it in my book. 5 Northern Ireland Secretaries of State worked with her: Humphrey Atkins, Jim Pryor, Douglas Hurd, Tom King, and Peter Brooke, who was by far the nicest, if not the most effective. That's in my view. I never heard her raise her voice in front of any of them, not even when she was confronted by Pryor, with whom she had always had a very tense relationship. It was Christmas 1982, and basically Pryor had been banished to Northern Ireland because he was part of the wet side of the Tory party, and they had a sort of equal loathing of each other, right? And he, as I said, he had launched this initiative for a constitutional convention in an attempt to get the politicians on all sides to sit down together. We were at Aldergrove, where a room had been set aside for her to deliver a prepared statement to the TV cameras in time for the tea time news bulletin. Some of the Downing Street staff were beginning to show signs of weariness, and I had a wife and 2 young sons waiting patiently at home, preparing for Santa's arrival. Mrs. Thatcher liked a stiff whisky, a Scotch whisky, and there was always bells at the end of every Northern Ireland visit. But before she could raise the tumbler after emerging from the makeshift television studio, Pryor thundered at her. He was almost puce with rage in the face. How could you go through with that and not talk about the convention? I can't believe you did that. He just couldn't contain himself. She fired him a withering look of such intensity that nobody who was there that night dared to respond. As Pryor turned to leave, Ingham, who was the press secretary, a very gruff Yorkshireman, looked at me as if to say, presumably you won't be reporting that. And he was right, I didn't. Eventually the Prime Minister's husband broke the silence. Dennis always travelled with her as well. Broke the silence to inquire if she had enough soda water. Yes, Dennis, she replied, I'll just take another dash if you don't mind. A small dash will do. And that was Margaret Thatcher.
Thanks, Deric. Thanks, Deric, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Rather than read a piece of the chapter I'd written, I thought I would try to explain to you, as best I can, those many meetings with the IRA and other organisations over that long period of time. And you know, people used to say to me, "That's a great job you have," and you know, some used to say, I remember a woman stopping me in this town. She says, "I hate those 3 words on their news in the morning." I said, "What are they?" She says, "Bran Rowan reports." Yeah. It's always bloody bad news, you know. And but just to let you in this little gathering, because we're in my hometown now, just to let you into a few of those little moments of meeting the IRA and how they happened. They always happened at short notice. You know, you didn't get a call from someone who used their name. You got a call with not many minutes to go to the meeting, and you kind of looked around for whatever scrap of paper you had in your hand. So along the way, I mean, I wrote these statements on all sorts of bits and pieces of paper. Many of you will remember when David Trimble went into government with Sinn Féin in 1999. Peter Mandelson was Secretary of State, and Mandelson had convinced, and Tony Blair had convinced Trimble, you go into government and the IRA will decommission weapons. And I was hearing all of that, but in many other meetings I was being told that wasn't going to happen. And it became actually one of the most difficult moments in my reporting career. The BBC was being called by the Northern Ireland office. I was being called after every broadcast. You're overstating your knowledge. You should reserve judgment. You're being told lies. And one of the people in the Northern Ireland office at that stage was a former colleague of mine at the BBC, Tom Kelly, who was our political correspondent and news editor in the period when I was security correspondent before I became security editor. And I felt a huge pressure. Could you not just be quiet? Could you not just do the right thing for the peace process? Could you just wait and see what happens? And I thought the right thing to do in that period was to inform people as best I could in terms of what was possible. And we got beyond that period of November 99 when Trimble had gone into government, and he had set a deadline for early 2000 for decommissioning to happen. And I remember it was a Saturday. It was the 5th of February 2000. And I got a call to go and meet P. O'Neill. And I wrote the IRA statement on these 2 Hollywood taxi dockets. That's what I had in my pocket at that time. And I wrote my news report for the BBC on the back of them. So this was 6 days before the government collapsed, when the IRA was making it clear again that there would be no decommissioning. And that was the scrap of paper I had on me at that time. But there was another occasion in 1996. The ceasefire had broken down in February that year. And by June, there was talk that the IRA was about to restore its ceasefire. And again, I was being told by the IRA that that's not going to happen. And again, I got a call on It was the 3rd of June 1996. My wife drove me from Hollywood. She dropped me off in West Belfast. I got picked up in a car. I was taken to a house, and P. O'Neill presented himself. He says, "You'll need to write." And the only thing I had on me at that time was the St. Column Kills church bulletin from the day before. Sunday, June the 2nd, 1996. People always say there's nothing interesting in those bloody bulletins. But on the back of it, I wrote the IRA briefing of June 3rd, 1996, which was ruling out a ceasefire, saying that it was remote in the extreme at that stage that would happen. And that became, as well as the BBC's headlines that night, it became the headlines across the national newspapers. Deric was writing it for the Press Association at that stage, along with his colleague Ian Graham. And 11 days later, the Manchester bomb exploded. So we wrote all of that on all sorts of scraps of paper at all sorts of times, never quite knowing what we were going to hear when we went to a meeting. Of course, there were big moments. There were big historic moments in all of that. Go ahead, Derek.
But I remember the day after the Brighton bomb.
Yes, of course.
Getting the phone call because Brian, he's very lucky. He has the paper. I was summoned to a side street, Sevastopol Street, off the Falls Road, to meet somebody, and was handed something like that there. It was the IRA statement. Funny enough, it was in lavender-coloured paper, typed, and the statement which said, "We only have to be lucky once. You have to be lucky all the time." And it was a huge story. It was basically the IRA were confirming that we were responsible for this attack. And Eamon Mally's been a great friend for 40 years. And I'm sorry he's not here tonight because you really would have enjoyed him. But there's one thing that I've never ever forgiven Mally for, and it's this. I gave him that piece of paper. And I've never seen it since. So I was just explaining
I have about 30,000 of these scraps of paper, notes, various notes at different times, now kind of filed in chronological order. Again, not for today, but for 20 or 30 years down the road. But I suppose that the big historic moment was August 1994, the IRA ceasefire announcement. And I remember my wife was 8 and a bit months pregnant at the time. August 31st was her birthday. And I knew that the statement was coming that day. And I remember around 6 o'clock in the morning, Val thought the baby was coming. And I thought, now, I didn't say this out loudly, but please not today. Please not today. But fortunately, it was a false alarm. And on my way to the BBC that morning at around 9 o'clock or shortly after, I got a call. The caller said, "Same place as Saturday, 11 o'clock, bring Eamon," meaning bring Eamon Mally. And I went into the BBC, and we have this morning meeting where the editorial staff meet. And the London editors were here, some of the London correspondents. Everyone knew that a ceasefire was imminent, and it was going to be big news, not just here, but it was going to be big news across the world. So I told around 4 or 5 people before the editorial meeting at 9:30 that we needed to be ready for an 11 o'clock news flash. And Donna Traynor was placed in the radio studio. They'd placed someone on the BBC roof to do the London broadcasts. And there was an agreement that when I got the statement, I would ring the top lines of it through before trying to dictate the entire statement. And that would become the news flash. And we went to a shopping centre in West Belfast for that meeting at 11 o'clock, walked into a coffee shop. I saw the woman sitting there who I knew was there to speak to us. And she had on her lap the tiniest piece of paper that you can imagine. I mean, this is a photograph of it, but the print was small. We weren't allowed to take this piece of paper. I borrowed it for one day afterwards to have it photographed for the inside cover of a book. But I've said many times since that I'd written the statement down very carefully, which I thought I had. But these are my actual notes from that morning, 5 pages on my jotter. It's a scrawl, because after she'd read the opening sentence, which was that from midnight that night there would be a complete cessation of military operations and all IRA units had been instructed accordingly. We asked her, could she pause so that we could phone that through to the newsrooms. I had a mobile phone at the time, which was the size of a brick. You can probably remember them. They looked like a car battery in many senses. And she said, no, my instructions are to read the statement in full. So she insisted upon reading the next 4 or 5 pages, and as those 4 or 5 pages went on, my scrawl became it was like money burning in your pocket. You know, this was big news to get out there, and that's what I did. I rang. We left that meeting. I went to the car park at the shopping centre. I got that mobile phone out, and I read those first couple of lines through. And Donna Traynor, within minutes of that, was reading the ceasefire statement, and the news went across the world. And Ivan Little, who co-edited this book with Deric, was with me a few weeks later when we were called to the Shankill Road to a meeting. We arrived, the 2 of us were brought into a room. There were 3 men sitting there. They were a representative from the UDA, one from the UVF, one from the Red Hand Commando. And they said to us that, I think what they said to us was, we want you to organise our news conference for tomorrow. And I looked at Ivan, and Ivan looked at me, and I said, look, we don't organise news conferences, we turn up to them. And we report them. And they said, no, that's not what we mean. We want you to get out there that there's going to be a news conference. And I said, well, look, then you'll have to give us something. You'll have to give us some information that would allow us to report it. So they sent for Gusty Spence, who was in the next room. Spence joined us in the room. He said, what is it? And I said, well, look, we're being told there's going to be some news event tomorrow. We need something to be able to report it. So Spence disappeared for a few minutes, and he came back with these 3 or 4 lines of typescript saying that there would be an unprecedented news conference the following morning, hosted jointly by the Progressive Unionist Party and the Ulster Democratic Party. And that then was the eve of the Loyalist ceasefire statement coming the next morning. So to be in the middle of all of that is this kind of huge privilege that I talk about. There is this tug of war between your professional duty and your citizenship. You know, we weren't foreign correspondents sent to cover a conflict elsewhere where we had no emotional attachment. I mean, we're stitched into the fabric of this place. We're part of it. We have families. We want this thing to work. But at the same time, there is that responsibility that while you want it to work, you also have that responsibility to report it as accurately as you possibly can, whether that is damaging to the peace process or not. You've got to, because in that moment, for instance, in 1999, when the NIO and Trimble were saying that decommissioning was going to happen, if I'd have sat in the studio and parroted those lines, and then for it not to happen, how could I have gone back into the studio 2 weeks later or 2 months later and say, I know I made a big mess of that one, but I now want you to believe me on this one. So there's that responsibility to do the job as best you can. And I suppose one of the things we would say to visiting journalists, visiting politicians, visiting academics who come here thinking we've got all of the answers, which of course we haven't, is that you do not report a conflict by taking sides or by talking to one side. You've got to talk across the board. You've got to try to keep yourself a bit distant from all of that. and you've got to do the best you can with the best information that you can gather. And I mean, I've said this before, there were times when I wanted to walk away and times when I wanted to run away.
Omagh, my hometown, in '98 was horrendous. I wouldn't go to Omagh, and I sent a team of about 20 reporters and photographers down there. And I remember the Sunday morning, as I always did, you went down and bought the papers, and especially this Sunday morning, and before you went into the office, because you were sort of basically marshalling the forces from here, and you were getting them in from London and none from Dublin, and you were making hotel bookings and all sorts of things. And I went into the newsagents and I could see all the papers on the stand, and I wouldn't buy any of the papers. I couldn't bring myself to buy any of the papers. But for me, probably the worst, the one really time it really got to me was in Loughin Island in '94. It was a Sunday morning, and we'd heard the previous night in the early hours, we were partying in a friend's house. My son Deric's school had just won the mini rugby tournament at Ravenhill, and I went down to Loughin Island that very wet, miserable Sunday morning with an absolutely thumping hangover. And back then, as journalists did, they would meet up together, and you would say to, say, John Mullen of The Guardian, you go to that house. Richard Kay from The Mail, you go to that house. Richard Ford from The Times, you go to that house. And Deric, he will go to this house. And this was the daughter of the eldest victim of the shooting the previous night when they were watching the World Cup match on television between the Republic and whatever. And I remember rapping the door, and this lady appeared, and she'd obviously been crying, and she was wearing a dress, a black dress. And I always remember it was obviously hurried or hurriedly removed from the bottom drawer for the period of mourning. And I always remember it was covered in white specks, you know, like whatever it was wool or something like that there, right? And she was fingering a handkerchief. And as you did back then, you introduced yourself. The usual line was, "Sorry for intruding on your grief, but could you help me with an interview about your late father, and if you could tell me what happened?" And she says, "Deric, I'd rather not." And I remember turning and walking away down the footpath, and I said to myself, never again am I going to knock a door. And that was the last time.
The abnormality of that period became the normality. We got used to the dark. We got used to people being killed. You know, I say quite often, people here died for 2 hours, meaning that they were dead on the 10 o'clock news, but somebody else was dead on the 12 o'clock news. A bit like the way we listen to Iraq and Afghanistan. We're kind of listening, but we're not hearing. And I think that's what started to happen here. That people became statistics rather than names and humans. The conflict dehumanized us all. And I suppose the challenge of 2019 is to rehumanize, to be people again. And I think about this stuff much more now than I did in the moment, because in the moment, you did what you had to do. But I think it's when you step back from these situations, when you reflect more, when you think more, when you have time to do all of that, then that's when it hits you. But I think you know, we're bogged down in these arguments over legacy and the past at the moment. And if we're not careful, we're going to bury ourselves in the next generation in the troubled years. That's what we're going to do. I don't see no healing and reconciliation in this legacy debate at the moment. I see people trying to create a parade of shame so long as they don't have to walk in it. And I think a conflict cannot be half over. It's either over or it's not over. And if it's over, then we need to grapple with the issue of amnesty. And we need to find a process that does not send soldiers or police officers or loyalists or Republicans to jail for the conflict period, but tries to achieve the maximum amount of information and practical help for those who are hurt the most. And I know that that's a poisonous issue to raise with some people, but it is nonetheless an issue that we need to address.
You know, I retired 5 years ago. I've moved on in my life. I'm doing all those things now. I'm consultant to the RHI Inquiry. I'm a consultant to the Royal Portrush for the Open Golf Championship. I've done a couple of books and so on. And I'm one of these people that was very lucky. I may have been touched by the Troubles, but I'm free of all bigotry and sectarianism. I've been incredibly lucky from that for a guy who came from the Church of Ireland. And you know, I'm of a view that it's time that we, and this might sound very hypocritical when I ask people to write about the past, that we should sort of draw a line here. It's not a very popular thing to say, I know, but we really need to move on. We should never forget, and we should also be very mindful of people who were affected by the Troubles, who will continue to be affected by the Troubles, the terrible life experiences that they had and still suffer from. But there's some very eloquent writing in the book. I mean, for instance, Susan McKay writes a great piece. Derville Fitzsimmons, about a young girl down in Fermanagh who was murdered by the IRA, Gillian Johnson. So, you know, there's everything in that book. It's a grim read, and this is not a sales pitch. It's a grim read. You don't take it to bed with you. You'll read a bit and leave it down, and it's quite depressing, actually. But those were the times in which we lived. And it's part of a storytelling process. It allowed those journalists who worked here to get something off their chest, or to look back or reflect. And you know, it's quite a small community, believe it or not, and we were very privileged because we had the most extraordinary access to people, you know, including that lady I met in Loughlin Island and so on. And you know, it took you to all, you know, various parts of the world as part of the whole peace process. If you weren't in Dublin or London, you were in Washington. You know, the whole Clinton area was amazingly exciting, and so on. But I just wish, and this isn't a lecture, but I just wish people could just, you know, when I look back at, for instance, at Good Friday, what for me was the highlight of my journalistic career. It was the most wonderful experience to be part of that, exhausting, exhilarated, and it was such a fantastic time. But when I look back and see where we are now, you know, I'm tempted to ask, it's almost like been 20 wasted years. You know, when we're sort of politically sort of adrift, hopelessly adrift, and not getting anywhere. I just think we really need to. Brexit has been a big distraction, I know, but we really need, people really need to knuckle down. It's time for big people to make big concessions and to try and sort of get back to where we were a few years ago.
I hate that line, drawing a line. I mean, I think it's so glib and trite, and easier to say for people who haven't lost someone or haven't been touched by the horrors of this situation. But having said that, I think what we need to deal with in terms of addressing legacy is an information process, is a practical help process, And they're talking about an archive, and I think they need to call it something else, because an archive suggests to people it's something that lies in some dusty corner somewhere, and if some academic wants to come along and look at it at some point. I think we need people's storytelling to be part of some memorial and part of some remembrance, because when you ask people to think back on the conflict period, we can all remember the headlines. You know, we remember Roma, we remember Loughin Island and Loughgall and the Shankill and Enniskillen and Le Mans. But beneath that remembering, so much is forgotten. The people who died on their own, you know, are the names that are not as easily recalled. So I think that's the sort of process we need. But if we're going to do 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 more investigations in that period that runs from the 60s into the 90s and beyond, and out of that, I heard the Chief Constable say recently, there is maybe a 3% prospect of sending someone to court and someone to jail for 2 years. Is that addressing the past? You know, one of the interviews that sticks in my head from all of the period of the conflict was a period I did in and around that an interview I did in and around the period of the Good Friday Agreement. There was the battle about prisoner releases versus victims' rights. And I interviewed a loyalist who had been a life sentence prisoner. And in the course of the interview, he said to me, "We sleep with the victims." I knew exactly what he meant, but I asked him to explain. And of course what he meant was that he couldn't sleep with what he had done. He couldn't sleep with what he'd done. And I remember beyond that interview, he did an interview with Peter Taylor. And then a couple of months later, he hanged himself. Now, I consider that man to be a victim of this conflict. That's not to condone what he did, but we are very comfortable talking about what happened, and we're not so comfortable talking about why it happened. So we cut out the political backstage to all of this on occasions, the cheering on from some. Think of the ages of those young people who were involved in that conflict in the 70s. And then think of the people who directed them, who put guns in their hands, bombs in their hands. And all of those people will exit this stage without any responsibility or accountability. I don't think that's addressing the past, that we send a few dozen people to jail because we're afraid to speak the word amnesty. And unless we get our heads around this, there'll be a room like this in 20 or 30 years' time, not with him and I here, but with 2 or 3 other people saying, why did we not do something about that then? You know, so we need a process, but we need a thinking process, and we need the right process. We're too small a place. You know, all of us remember something. You know, this was round the corner from us. It was down the road from us. We're all emotionally attached to it. And sometimes you needed that outside voice that said to you, but, you know. And it's why I think we need an outside voice to deal with this legacy question. I mean, the idea that, you know, we need George Mitchell to do the politics, we need John de Chastelain to do the weapons, we needed Chris Patton to do the RUC and policing reform, but yet we think 5 political parties and 2 governments can sort out legacy. They're part of the problem. They shouldn't be anywhere near it. You know, the idea that they would create a process that will take us out of this, I just think it's ludicrous. And if we leave it to them, that's what I mean about in 20 or 30 years' time, we'll be sitting here saying, why have we not got that sorted out? You know? I'm not sure there'll be a Stormont at the centenary of Northern Ireland. And I'm not sure there should be. I mean, that's where I'm at. I don't hear anyone saying to me, we need Stormont back tomorrow. I hear people saying we need somewhere where decisions are made. But that doesn't necessarily mean Stormont. And our politics is moving beyond devolution versus direct rule. There's a third pillar now which is about what a new Ireland might look like. And while a number of years ago that would have been dismissed as idle talk, it's not been dismissed now. So we need to open our eyes. I mean, I heard some of the commentary today around, manifesto launches. If you don't vote for us, you'll get them. Is that where we are in 2019? Give me a break. Give us all a break.
Absolutely fascinating and moving and powerful. We're very, very grateful. I would ask everyone again to show their thanks for Brian and Sarah.